Excuse me. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Today is December 3rd, 2011. Okay, good morning everyone.
Good morning, Bhante.
Okay, so today we will be taking Sutta number 62 in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is the greater discourse or the longer discourse of advice to Rahula. And the last sutta that we studied was the discourse of advice to Rahula at Ambalatika. It's actually a very short discourse, and as we pointed out, it was given by the Buddha to Rahula when Rahula was, I think according to the commentary, 11 years old. So he was just a young boy. Now this discourse is given to Rahula, according to the commentary, when he was 18 years old. So now he's turning from a boy into a young man, and his thinking is starting to get flow along in the accustomed pattern of the way a young man will think. And so the Buddha speaks this discourse in order to correct his way of thinking. Okay, so the sutta begins when the Buddha was living in Savatthi, in Jeta's Grove at Savatthi. And then one morning the Buddha put on his dress with his robes, and he took his bowl, and he went into Savatthi on alms round. And then the Venerable Rahula followed close behind the Buddha. Okay, now the commentary gives an explanation why the Buddha gives first we'll take the sutta. Okay, then the sutta says that as they were walking along on the way to the alms round, the Buddha turned around and he spoke to Venerable Rahula thus. He said, Rahula, any kind of material form, whatever, whether past, future or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, all such material forms should be seen as it actually is with proper wisdom. Thus, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. Okay, now it seems a little bit peculiar that just at the time when they are walking along from the Jeta's Grove Monastery into the town of Savatthi, the Buddha should stop right on the middle of the alms round, turn around, and give some instruction to Rahula. So the question comes up, why does the Buddha speak to Rahula like this on this occasion? And here what the commentary, how it gets its information, I don't know, but this is what the commentary says. That as they were walking along, Rahula started to, his eyes focused on the figure of the Buddha walking in front of him, and the Buddha seemed to him a very magnificent physical body. He was tall, strongly built, beautiful features. And then Rahula reflected back on his own physical form and his features, and he realized that he too inherited he too had genetically inherited these features of the Buddha. He was also apparently quite handsome, strongly built, probably tall for his age, quite regal in his manner because they came from the Kshatriya clan, the aristocratic clan. And so Rahula was thinking that the Buddha is like, you see, in Indian culture they consider the elephant to be a majestic animal rather than something which is ugly and distorted. So Rahula thought the Buddha is like a royal elephant and I am like a little elephant, an elephant cub. Or the Buddha is like a lion who has come out from his den and I am like a lion cub. The Buddha is like a tiger strolling through the mountains and I am like a tiger cub. Or the Buddha is like a great boat which has been launched out on the sea and I'm like a small boat. And so when he was thinking those deluded thoughts that were kind of expressed a kind of clinging to physical form, the Buddha thought to himself, what is Rahula thinking on this occasion? And then using his power of reading the minds of others, he knew exactly what Rahula was thinking. And so he realized that if Rahula continues to cling to this physical form, this will become a basis of conceit, a basis of attachment, a basis of lust, which will lead him off from the path to liberation. And so the Buddha realized that in order to cut off those thoughts right at the root, as soon as they're arising, he has to give Rahula very pointed, concise instructions on how to contemplate the body or form as it really is. That is, to see the body in the light of anatta, in the light of non-self. And so he says, whatever kind of form there is, past, present, or future, all this should be seen as it really is with right wisdom. This is not mine. This I am not. This is not myself. Okay, now Rahula was quite intelligent young man. And so when he heard this question, thought came to him. When the Buddha says this, is he speaking only with reference to material form, or with reference to the whole complex of factors that make up personal identity? And so Rahula then asks the Buddha, he says, are you saying this only about material form? Only about material form? Then the Buddha says, I'm saying this about material form, but also about feeling, perception, the volitional formations or volitional activities, and consciousness. Okay, so we have here, in this very short passage, an extremely concise formulation of the Buddha's teaching of anatta, non-self. Okay, what exactly does the teaching of non-self mean? What is the purpose of the teaching, and why is it formulated precisely in this way? We always come across this formulation again, well, we come across this formulation again and again in the suttas. First, we have the 5 aggregates. These are the 5 constituents of individual identity. And so when the Buddha speaks about a human being or any kind of sentient being, he speaks about the being by analyzing the constituents of experience into these 5 categories, 5 groups of factors. I know that I've gone through this several times, but it doesn't hurt to hear it again. And each time one gets new questions or new understanding. Okay, so the Buddha analyzes the living being into the 5 aggregates. And of the 5 aggregates, 1, the aggregate of material form, is physical or material. And it includes all the physical components of the person. In other words, the body and all aspects of all the physical aspects of experience. And then the other 4 aggregates are mental. And the way I understand it, of the 5 aggregates, probably we could say that the 2 primary ones are material form, or the body, and consciousness. Consciousness is what contributes the element of awareness, which I call it the light of awareness, which sort of opens up through the 5 physical sense faculties and through the mind, and it makes possible the experience of an objective world. Then the middle 3 aggregates I see as 3 mental functions that arise primarily based on consciousness, but always, in case of human experience, operating through the sense faculties, including the 6th faculty, the mental faculty. And so, when we experience what I call the flavor of an object as being either pleasant or unpleasant, agreeable or disagreeable, or neither, that is feeling. So feeling is that particular mental function that is able to sort of draw out, suck up the flavor of an object, that can determine whether the object is agreeable or disagreeable, pleasant, unpleasant, pleasurable or painful. Okay, then the mental function which selects the object out of the objective field, which determines its nature, which selects certain features of the object for special focus. This mental function is what we call sanya, which is what we translate perception. So it's through perception, or sanya, that we're able to identify things. We identify things initially. When we see something for the first time, then we single it out, and by reason of its marks and features, we ascribe a certain character to it, or we can subsume it under conceptual categories. So, if I see this for the first time, then I think this is the first time that I've seen this. Usually we've had a ceramic cup. So this is a black metal flask. So I select the color, black. I select the shape to determine it as a flask, and I see inside there's water, and when I drink the water, though there's only water in there, I get a very slight taste of oolong tea, which arouses a strong craving in me. Why do I get water instead of oolong tea? So anyway, by reason of the presence of water, then I identify this as a flask for holding water. So all of this is the work of perception. And now this is the first time that I've seen it, but if next week I come back and there is this metal flask here with the black leather to make it easy to hold so that one doesn't get burnt. So then I'll recognize, that's the same flask that I was using last week. And if there is oolong tea instead of water, then I'll know that somebody has listened and fulfilled my wish. Okay, so this is perception, and the 4th aggregate is the aggregate by which we generally respond to perceptual stimuli in terms of choices, decisions, volitions, culminating in actions. So this is called the Sankhara Khanda, which many different ways to understand the word Sankhara. But here usually the Buddha, in other suttas, he says that volition is what I call Sankhara. So volition is actually the chief factor in the aggregate of volitional activities. And volition is the factor, the mental factor that's responsible for actions. So when I see this flask, I see it's filled with water, then I also experience maybe a little bit of thirst. So then there comes the desire to drink. That desire itself is a volition. And then comes the decision to pick up the flask, to move it to my lips, and then to take a sip of water. All of these are volitional activities. And taking a sip of water is just a relatively simple, ordinary, harmless volitional activity. But it's from the volitional activities that there originate all of the morally wholesome and morally unwholesome actions that constitute what the Buddha calls karma. So the Buddha says it's volition that I call karma, because it's from the volitional through the volitional activities that we act. We act bodily, we act through speech, we formulate thoughts, decisions, emotions, and so on. And all of these generate either wholesome or unwholesome karma. So these are volitional activities. And then the aggregate of consciousness, as I said, is, I call it the light of awareness that arises through the 6 sense faculties. So when the Buddha explains the aggregate of consciousness, he divides it into 6 types, depending on the base through which it arises. So it can arise, the consciousness that arises based on the eye faculty is eye consciousness, which performs the function of seeing. The consciousness that arises based on the ear is called ear consciousness. And so with the other 5 sense consciousnesses, then the consciousness that arises based purely on the mental faculty, the consciousness that takes purely mental objects, images, ideas, concepts, thoughts, this is called mind consciousness, or reflective consciousness. And so it might be important to note, sometimes the question comes up, and it's the question that I've sort of struggled with myself. What is the difference between consciousness and perception? Because they seem quite close. In fact, there's a sutta which explains the 5 aggregates, and it says, what is perception? One perceives blue, yellow, red, white. What is consciousness? One cognizes, or one knows, sweet, sour, bitter, salty, some other flavors. Which is a little puzzling, because it seems that the sutta is trying to pinpoint the difference between perception and consciousness, in that perception is involved with colors, and consciousness is concerned with taste. But I have to say, I suspect that sutta, that it's not, I don't think it's really complete enough. Because there's also perception of taste. So perception operates in regard to all types of sense objects. But I find more helpful are other suttas which explain perception always in terms of the object. So what is perception? Perception of forms, perception of sounds, perception of smells, perception of tastes, perception of tactile sensations, perception of mental objects. But consciousness is always described, or let's say 99% of the time it's described based on the sense faculty through which it arises. So how do the texts analyze consciousness? eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and mind or mental consciousness. So based on this, I see the difference between perception and consciousness to be that consciousness, I call the light of awareness that arises based on a particular sense faculty. And when consciousness arises based on the sense faculty, it throws open that particular objective domain to experience, to awareness. Perception, once that light of consciousness illuminates that objective domain, then the function of perception, or sanya, is to single out, to select particularly conspicuous or impressive objects within that objective domain, and then label them or designate them and incorporate them within a framework, a conceptual framework. And so it's through, to come back to the flask, it's through eye consciousness that this whole visual field opens up, and within this visual field there is the flask. And then when my mind focuses on that flask, then I single it out and designate it, mentally designate it flask, and recognize it maybe as similar to other flasks. Then that is the act of sanya, of perception. Okay, so these are the 5 aggregates. Anybody have any questions on anything that has come up at this point? Okay, Patrick. There's a microphone.
Where does the attitude come in?
Attitude.
Yes.
Yeah, attitude probably would come in under the aggregate of volitional activities, even though it's not a volitional activity in itself, but this aggregate of volitional activities is used almost like we would call an umbrella category to include all types of mental functions that don't fall under the other aggregates. So within the different Abhidharma systems, all the other mental factors that are mentioned in the suttas, apart from feeling and perception, are classified in the aggregate of volitional activities. Sandy?
Hi, Mate. In the case of delusion, what I mean delusion is referring to the people with mental illness, especially when they have delusion.
Oh.
So, yeah, when people have delusion.
A delusion, yeah.
Yeah, so is the thought of in perception or the thought in consciousness?
I would say that probably delusion itself as a mental factor would come within the aggregate of volitional activities. Probably. I'm just thinking of the way the Abhidharma classifies well, let us say delusion as a proclivity would come within the aggregate of mental activities. But delusion as a proclivity would then influence perception so that people would then perceive things in deluded ways. So somebody, this is the classical case of the drunk man who says, "But there's a pink elephant in the room." And that's what, I don't know whether they say that anymore, but we always used to say that when somebody gets very drunk, they say that there's a pink elephant in the room. So his perception of the pink elephant is, certainly it's a perception. It belongs in the perception aggregate. But maybe the state of intoxication that disposes him to see the pink elephant in the room, that mental intoxication would be in the aggregate of mental activities, or volitional activities.
I thought you initially said devotion.
I thought you said devotion first, but then...
Yeah, I thought you said devotion or delusion.
Delusion.
Not devotion.
Delusion.
I thought you
Yeah, first I heard devotion, but then when you
first
went
said
on...
devotion.
But devotion would come also under the aggregate of volitional activities.
Then, what about in the case of hallucination? Because hallucination is different from delusion.
Yeah, probably hallucination would be... It seems... I mean, I just have to guess here because I don't recall cases where hallucinations are discussed in the text. But I would say probably it affects primarily perception. So it's the distortion of perception. Andre?
Hi, Bhante. I think what's sometimes difficult, I think especially for like the Western mindset, is we have a different view of what consciousness is, like this all-reaching, overarching, sort of light awareness, as you call it.
Yeah.
But you're right, like in the suttas, it just seems strange to it's really ground down. Eye, ear, nose, tongue, tactile. We're not used to, at least in this culture, we're not really used to thinking of consciousness as that way. That's at least my perception.
It's what?
At least my perception, no pun intended. I think that can make it maybe difficult. I mean, does anybody here usually think of, my eye consciousness? We just think that we're conscious of stuff that goes on.
Yeah.
So I think that could be...
Yeah,
it's really ground down into components.
Yeah.
Also, sometimes santras, I notice, are sometimes also translated as fabrications.
Yeah, that is Achan Tanisar, who uses fabrications.
Yeah. He's not dogmatic about it, but he just feels, because he was talking about what you call the umbrella aspect, the clearinghouse aspect of that particular conduct, that so much can kind of go underneath that.
Yeah, in a way, fabrications also, it's pretty much almost like based on the etymology of the word sankhara. Because sankhara comes from the verb that underlies it is karoti, which means to make, and then it has the prefix sang, which together.
Mm-hmm.
So sankhara is putting together, assembling, or constructing.
Which is also active and doing.
Yeah, it's an act of doing. The little problem with fabrication is that the fabrications that usually we think of things that are manufactured rather than the act of manufacturing. Whereas in sankhara, the emphasis is on the doing aspect rather than the product. But sometimes the word sankhara also has the meaning of the products, the things that are fabricated or put together.
But it's also, I usually think of it when I read the word as volitional fabrications, trying to sort of get both in.
Yeah,
there's
okay,
activities, but it's also when your mind just fabricates and fabricates.
Yeah, that's good actually.
Just one.
I used in the Samyutta Nikaya translation volitional formations, but I wasn't so happy with formations, again because it suggests too much the product rather than the activity. So now when the Anguttara Nikaya translation comes out, you'll find volitional activities. Please take the microphone.
Thank you, Venerable. As we were discussing before about the awakened mind as being possibly the only thing that's actually real, where would that fit in?
Say it again.
We were discussing, you and I were discussing after breakfast about the awakened mind being perhaps the only thing that actually is real. And many schools feel that focusing on that awakened mind is in fact an upaya, or a very, very powerful methodology towards actually bringing that into manifestation.
Yeah.
Where would that possible truth fit in?
That seems to be an idea that developed in the course of later Buddhism. In early Buddhism, the Buddhism of the Nikayas, mind is not really given a special prominence as being more real than the other factors of experience. but all the factors are sort of on the same boat, and more the emphasis is on seeing them or penetrating them as being impermanent, dukkha, or bound up with suffering and non-self. Okay, I want to move on now to come into, because this is just laying out the scheme of the 5 aggregates, but now the important point in the Buddha's teaching, which he's conveying here to Rahula, is that all the 5 aggregates should be seen as they actually are with proper wisdom, as this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. So this is a capsule statement of the Buddha's teaching on anatta. And now why does the Buddha place a special stress on the teaching of anatta? And that is because according to the Buddhist sort of analysis of the problem of suffering, the Buddha sees that suffering originates from clinging to the 5 aggregates. So he's not laying out the scheme of the 5 aggregates just to develop a theoretical framework, a theoretical analysis of a living being or a human person, but he's laying out this framework in order to show what are the objects to which one clings.
Would it be grasping?
Grasping, clinging, they're just different translations of the same word. Okay, so the 5 aggregates are called the 5 aggregates which are connected to clinging, which are subject to clinging, and so they become the sphere, the things to which we cling. And when we cling to them, the way we primarily cling to them is by taking them to be I, or to be mine, what I am, myself. Okay, so through clinging, we grasp one or another of the 5 aggregates, and we think, initially we think, this is mine. Somehow we take ourselves to be something apart from the aggregate, and we hold it as mine. And then this, what's said, becomes a sort of, this is an expression of craving. It's through craving to have some kind of identity that we hold the aggregates as being mine, my possessions, my belongings. Or else we identify with the aggregate, saying, this is what I am. I am body, I am feeling, I am perception, I am volition, I am consciousness. And this is said to be an expression of conceit, conceiving oneself with the conceit, I am. And then at a more theoretical level, then we formulate the view, this is myself. This is my permanent, eternal essence. And then this is the way we formulate views of self. And so here we have craving, conceit, and views of self, which these 3 defilements the Buddha holds to be the sort of driving forces behind the cycle of birth and death. And all of them, all 3 of them, originate from ignorance, avijja, which means not knowing things as they really are, not seeing and knowing things as they really are. And so we have ignorance of the true nature of five aggregates. Ignorance of the true nature of the five aggregates leads to this clinging to the aggregates as being mine, I, and myself. And the ideas of mine, I, and myself are expressions, respectively, of craving, conceit, and the view of self. Okay, so the Buddha has to, in order to eliminate ignorance, he develops or proposes this, we call a strategy of contemplating the five aggregates as being not in any way the self or the belongings of a self. In other words, one contemplates the five aggregates as being not mine, not what I am, not myself. Which doesn't mean that beyond the five aggregates, the Buddha is pointing to some kind of transcendent self, but rather, in the Buddha's sort of methodology, the contemplation of the five aggregates as being non-self uproots ignorance, or gradually it removes craving, conceit, and wrong views, and when they are eroded, then there comes a liberation. Okay, so the characteristic of non-self is often said to be the most difficult, extremely difficult to see. And so in many suttas, the Buddha approaches non-self indirectly by laying out the scheme of three characteristics. That is, impermanence, suffering, and non-self. So what's said to be the most evident, the most obvious of the three characteristics is impermanence, because as one contemplates the body, feelings, perceptions, and so on, one could see, once the awareness becomes sharp enough, that they're always arising and passing away. When one sees the impermanence of the five aggregates, then one realizes that the five aggregates are, you can say, are not a basis of security, that they cannot provide any kind of secure, lasting, stable happiness. So this means that they are, maybe we could say, defective, or dukkha. Here, this is the word usually translated suffering. It doesn't mean that the five aggregates are always basis for misery, sorrow, and grief, but rather that they're defective, flawed, unable to provide a basis, a secure, permanent basis for happiness. And then, when one sees the five aggregates as being impermanent and bound up with dukkha, with suffering, then one stops identifying with them. One no longer wants to hold to them, to cling to them as being mine, I, myself. So that's the way the Buddha usually proceeds, or often proceeds, moving from impermanence to dukkha, then from impermanence and dukkha together to non-self. But apparently he must have had some high regard for the Venerable Rahula's intellectual capacities, since without any indirect procedure, he moves directly into the teaching of non-self and tells Rahula, the five aggregates, see them with proper wisdom. This is not mine, this I am not. This is not myself.
Yeah, it's not that easy.
Excuse me?
It's not that easy.
Even though we get the insight to see all the aggregates and clingings and non-self, even so, it's not that easy to break, to have your mind liberated from it.
Of course, if it were easy, then everybody would be liberated.
It's extremely difficult. How to make it successful? Any suggestion?
Excuse me?
How do one make it successfully releasing clinging? Any suggestion?
Of course, one has to go step by step. And here, the Buddha, because Rahula must have been somebody with quite mature spiritual faculties, so the Buddha could speak to him directly at a very high level. But most of us don't have sharp faculties, so we have to begin training, step by step, by observing precepts, then by practicing simple meditation, using simple meditation objects. But as we go through the sutta, we're going to see that the Buddha will elaborate more and more on these teachings to he'll be laying down stepping stones so that we could approach the insight into selflessness more easily. Yeah.
Has Venerable Rahula reached stream entered yet at this point?
This was something that occurred to me just the other day. I don't
think so.
recall a sutta where it says that Rahula has reached stream entry. I know the Sutta 147 in the Majjhima Nikaya. In that sutta, the Buddha teaches him and he reaches arhatship. Is there a little blind spot in my memory? Does somebody who knows the suttas well remember a sutta where Rahula reaches stream entry? It's something I have to look through. I don't recall a sutta that states it.
I got the feeling he has yet to reach stream entry
It's quite
during
possible.
this sutra.
It's quite possible that he hasn't reached it. Okay, let us go on, because I wanted to go through at least the 5 elements meditation today. Okay, so now when the Buddha gave this instruction to Rahula, then Rahula thought to himself, who would go into town for alms today when personally admonished or personally instructed by the Buddha? Probably if I were there and the Buddha gave that advice to me, I'd thought, why are we stopping? I'm hungry. Let's hurry, get into town, get our food, have a lunch, then you can teach me all you want after lunch. But Rahula thought to himself that it's extremely rare to get this very personal instruction from the Buddha, even though Rahula was the Buddha's own physical son. But the Buddha would usually be instructing the monks, in large groups. And now he's gotten this very personal, very direct piece of advice from the Buddha. And so instead of continuing on the alms round, he turns back, he goes to a tree for the shade, sits down under the tree, crosses his legs, and then sets up mindfulness in front of him. And obviously he's probably contemplating the 5 aggregates as non-self based on the Buddha's advice. Okay, now as Rahula is sitting there, Venerable Sariputta probably a little bit later came along to go to Savatthi for alms. And he sees Rahula sitting there, and then he says to Rahula, develop mindfulness of breathing. When mindfulness of breathing is developed and cultivated, it is of great fruit and great benefit. The commentary says that, again, I don't know where the commentaries get this information from, but they say that when Sariputta saw Rahula sitting under the tree with his body erect, his legs crossed, he thought that he must be practicing mindfulness of breathing, because in doing mindfulness of breathing, normally one sits cross-legged, holding the body erect. And now this advice created a little conflict for Rahula. And why was there this conflict in Rahula's mind?
Is it cheating if I look at the footnote?
Cheating if you look at the back note.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then I wouldn't.
Anybody have any idea?
Well, hasn't the Buddha instructed him to contemplate non-self and...
Yeah, well that is the conflict.
Yeah.
Yeah, but why should, when the Buddha instructs him, then certainly one would think he should follow the Buddha's advice, not Sariputta's advice. But there's a special relationship between Sariputta and Rahula. Excuse me?
Sariputta is the teacher of Rahula,
Exactly.
and is ordained teacher.
Yeah, exactly, that is it. I think I did mention that the other day when I gave a background story about how Rahula became a monk.
That was last sutra.
Yeah, yeah. The Buddha didn't ordain Rahula himself, but when Rahula came and asked to become a monk, then the Buddha turned to Sariputta and he instructed Sariputta, ordain Rahula. So Sariputta is Rahula's teacher, his ordination teacher, and the Buddha is, the supreme teacher. And so Rahula has now gotten different instructions from different teachers. And so he has to find a way to negotiate this. Presumably he continued meditating according to the Buddha's instructions. But then in the evening, he comes to the Buddha and pays homage to him and asks, how does one practice mindfulness of breathing so that it is of great fruit and great benefit? But the Buddha doesn't answer Rahula's question directly. He will answer it later in the sutta. But now he still wants to train Rahula in contemplation of the body as non-self. And I find this sequence particularly interesting because, when we start, almost when anybody starts meditation, you start off with the instruction on mindfulness of breathing. That's considered the most basic, the most rudimentary meditation subject in Buddhism. But we could see that the Buddha doesn't necessarily start people off with mindfulness of breathing, but according to the particular capacities, dispositions, the need of the person, the Buddha will tailor his instructions. And so for Rahula now, the particular problem that's been obstructing him is this pride in his physical beauty and his attachment to his body. So now the Buddha wants to show Rahula the way to overcome that attachment to the body. And so he's going to do this by teaching the meditation on the 5 elements, the 4 primary elements and the space element. Okay, so he says, Rahula, whatever internally belonging to oneself is solid, solidified, and clung to. He's now going to start with the earth element. And then he enumerates, I think it's 12 or 20 constituents of the body that represent the earth element. At the analytical level, every constituent of the body has all 4 of the primary elements. Because all of these 4 elements necessarily coexist. So anything that's solid, even something hard like teeth or the fingernails, has the earth element, water element, it has the fire element, some degree of heat, and the air element. The 4 elements at the philosophical level represent 4 properties of matter. The earth element is the property of solidity, or maybe we could say resistance, the property by which matter resists compression. the water element is the aspect of flowing or mobility, and also it's said to be the aspect of cohesion, of being binding together, sticking together. The fire element represents bodily heat, and the air element represents pressure, oscillation, movement, expansion, contraction. Okay, but even though all four elements are present through every part of the body, but in certain parts, one element or another is more prominent than the others. Okay, so the parts in which the earth element is prominent, hairs of the head, hairs of the body, fingernails, toenails, teeth, skin, the flesh or muscles, the sinews, bones, the marrow, kidneys, heart, liver, diaphragm, spleen, lungs, large intestines, small intestines, contents of the stomach, feces, or anything else belonging to oneself that's solid, solidified, and clung to. This is called the internal earth element. Okay, now proceeding further,